All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our, I think, sixth iteration of the CDAC Summer Lab Speaker Series. We have an incredibly exciting talk today focused around the theme of reproducibility and replicability. I've been practicing saying those words all morning. We have two pioneers in these fields joining us this morning, Victoria Stodden and Kate Keahey. So I will try and make my intro part as brief as possible so that we get to hear from these fantastic speakers for as much of the time as possible, and also save time for questions as well. As a reminder, after this talk, Dr. Keahey and her team at Chameleon, I think Jason is joining us, are putting on our second tech demo using their kind of pioneer tool Chameleon. You'll get to hear more about what that is and then hopefully test it out during this tech demo. So please stick around in the Zoom room afterwards. Should be a great time. As a reminder, we will hear from both speakers first and then save Q&A for the end for both speakers. But as a reminder, feel free to post questions that you have as they come up in the chat during the talks. And the speakers may address them during the talks. We may also save them later for live Q&A. But also, if you like, during live Q&A, feel free to raise your hand and you'll be able to unmute and ask a question directly to our speakers. All right, well, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Victoria Stodden. Dr. Stodden is an associate professor in the Daniel J. Epstein Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at the University of Southern California. Before joining USC, she was an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and prior to that was an assistant professor of statistics at Columbia University. Dr. Stodden is a pioneer in the field of reproducible research, and her research focuses on ways of improving processes for transparency and verifiability of computational data inference methods. She has a unique and storied academic background. She received her law degree and PhD in statistics from Stanford, and she received her master's in economics from the University of British Columbia and her BA in economics from the University of Ottawa, where she graduated summa cum laude. We are incredibly lucky to have Dr. Stodden joining us today for her second CDAC Speaker Series appearance. So please join me in welcoming her to the virtual CDAC Summer Lab stage.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. I want to just jump in with a question. So I don't know if I was the only one who just saw a blank white screen when you were talking. Did everybody else see text?
I could see text.
That's
okay.
Great.
Okay. So I don't. It
For
must
me
be
as well.
Oh, good. Okay. So you saw the text of the introduction. So hopefully you were reading along to my notes at the same time. Sorry about that. We will fix that for the next intro.
No, it must be me. Okay, so
no
let me go ahead and share my screen and just say what an incredible introduction. Thank you so much. I'm kind of listening, thinking, do I even know this person? That was really great, Katie. Thank you. So I was given about 20 minutes to talk to you all, and I've been really looking forward to this, and I've been especially looking forward to parts that Kyle and Katie have emphasized around sort of why I'm working on this, and how I got to this point of working on these problems and so on. So 20 minutes is not a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is try to very quickly give you an idea of how I'm framing the concept of reproducibility in my work, why this is something that is getting headlines in the New York Times and everybody seems to be talking about it. And, you might be thinking, why is this suddenly such a big issue when, we've had reproducibility as part of science for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, I was taught in grade school about reproducibility. So what is the deal going on right now? Like, why do people suddenly care? So I'm going to try to at least give my theory on why that is. I'd like to mention a couple of examples of recent work that I've been doing, just to sort of give you an idea of the types of things that I've been working on. And then I'd like to leave time at the end, and I'll try to give you a little bit of a story about, how I got to working on this. And of course, happy to take any questions. I don't think I can see chat when I'm looking at my slides, but if there are questions, people can, jump in and stop me if there's something that's not clear. And I really look forward to the discussion. Okay, so some notable reproducibility examples. So the first thing I want to say about reproducibility is just like all kinds of endeavors across society, science is also being disrupted by technology. And in my view, this is at the core of the reproducibility discussion. So you think of things like Uber disrupting our traditional taxi system. How did that happen? Essentially, they generated an app and people were able to call cars through an app rather than having to pick up the phone and call a taxi or try to hail it on the street, right? And so this is something that we generally call disruption. And most of disruption points to things like leveraging the use of new technologies to try to offer different services or do things differently. Similarly, in scientific research, I mean, we're not generating apps to do our research, although maybe we should, but what we are doing is thinking creatively about how to use technology to accelerate science. And a lot of that comes down to leveraging massive computational power, leveraging data collection affordances that we've never had before, and leveraging the sort of codification of methods and how much easier it becomes to apply these data inference methods to the data itself. So it's not just that the sort of nuts and bolts technology has advanced, but also the layers and applications have really advanced that allow us to do the data inference. So in a nutshell, I think our reproducibility issues that we're facing come down to things like, how do we ensure work, scientific research, is reproducible in the sense of the results are reproducible, the findings that are coming from the data, when now we've leveraged all of these complex technologies in order to get these results. So if you think about how we would typically ensure work is reproducible, typically for hundreds of years, we would write it up in words, right? We had the methods section in a paper. You can't publish a paper without a methods section. It just immediately gets rejected. And think about the last time you did a calculation from data, some set of measurements, maybe with some hypothesis you were interested in, or just trying to explore what's in the data. And think about whether you could explain what you did in words. You can probably explain it in code, right? Because a lot of this is computational steps. And so that gap is where I see a lot of these reproducibility issues coming in. We've brought a lot of complexity in the disruption that this technology is bringing to science. It's accelerating science. We're doing, much more ambitious work than we've ever done in the past. But thinking about how do we actually ensure that work is transparent, is verifiable. I know what you did computationally in order to get those results, right? And I want to know without asking you. And so that's the heart of the reproducibility issue. And there's a lot of challenges and really deep intellectual challenges about how we expose these computations that underlie data science results and all kinds of computationally enabled scientific discovery. So the communities, so scientific communities are extremely diverse, extremely heterogeneous, work on many different types of problems with all different ways of working in different cultures and so on. And these different communities have sort of started to put their minds around this reproducibility issue in all kinds of different ways. So I just have a couple of examples here. So one group, very, very large, influential group that is thinking about reproducibility issues is the biosciences, or life sciences. And painting with a very broad brush, they were kind of kicked into action in 2012 when there was a publication in Nature where Amgen tried to reproduce published results. Now, these were lab-based experiments. They went into the lab and they tried to reproduce it. Now, these lab-based experiments also had computational aspects. They had data collection aspects. The lab was producing data, but they tried to reproduce 53 landmark papers in cancer oncology, and they could only get 6 of the results just based on the paper. Now that was published, like I said, in Nature in 2012. The community really reacted to this. Why isn't more of our work reproducible? We need new standards. We need to do things about that. We need more rigor and so on. So it really did affect people. And those discussions are ongoing. You can see them in National Institutes of Health with their emphasis on rigor and reproducibility came after 2012. changing standards. There's lots of publications about this and lots of attention on this. And the discussion is ongoing, and it's still, it's still something that people are very actively engaged in. So that's one. Another example, if you look at something like IEEE, so Engineering Society, there are steps going on across IEEE. I like putting these two examples next to each other, life sciences and IEEE, because they're about as different as you can do research. But even in engineering, you're seeing steps towards reproducibility. So for example, in robotics publications, editors are saying, how do we know that even the control codes, for example, on your robots are doing things that are reproducible or understandable or transparent? And there are workshops, as you can see, how do we share and preserve data, code, other artifacts? It could even be hardware, for example, associated with these publications. The theme that you're seeing probably through all of this is you're seeing the researchers leveraging the new technologies. They're leveraging computational technology. They're leveraging the data technology here that has just exploded over the last 10, 20 years. Okay, here's my third example. And this one happened in social psychology. So there was coincidentally also in 2012. So you sort of see these similar types of efforts happening at the same time, and that also helps catalyze this larger discussion across the sciences. Social psychology, quite different from the biosciences, quite different from engineering. They have, again, ongoing and very active reproducibility discussions that started around 2012, or a little earlier than 2012. And many of these discussions were based around questions that were raised in an area of social psychology called priming studies. So the idea there is that you can affect the outcome of a particular engagement or event or an experiment by taking the subject, so social psychology is dealing with people, and priming them with some kind of exposure or something before the actual experiment takes place. So a classic example is something like you want to ask people say about their impressions of elderly. So you might be able to just ask people straight up about their impressions, or you might ask them after two elderly people walk in front of them, right? And so they're sort of primed for the question. And so the question is, how does priming affect the outcomes and so on? So there's a lot of investigation into priming. Now there's a Nobel laureate named Daniel Kahneman who is quite well known, and he wrote an email to members of the sort of priming community in social psychology, and he essentially was saying, look, we've got to get our act together in terms of reproducibility. Many of these priming studies didn't replicate when people went to do it. So someone would say there was an effect from having, say, the elderly couple walk in front before you ask them questions. Others would go ahead and do that and wouldn't get the same outcome. And so there were sort of these questions. And you can go ahead and read Kahneman's email. It's all available. It's published in Nature. And so since then, many initiatives are coming forward in social psychology, like, for example, Center for Open Science. There are initiatives around publication of different types of papers, experimental publications happening in social psychology, a lot of work and a lot of activity around reproducibility. And there are many other areas where reproducibility has had long-standing discussions. So those are just three I just wanted to highlight. They're relatively recent in 2012, so they sort of get a lot of the press attention. But questions around transparency and computation go back to the early 1990s in the geosciences and geophysics, in signal processing, for example, even in databases. These communities have, 20 years of discussions about how do we bring scientific rigor and scientific standards when we use these much more complex computational and data enabled technologies. So these discussions are happening all over. Every discussion has its certain color and flavor depending on the community that initiates it and what type of research they do, what they perceive the problems to be. So it's all very interesting. Okay, so this is 3 examples of recent work. It's actually 2. I shortened it because there's quite a lot to talk about, and I do want to leave time for discussion. So the first question, the first project I wanted to mention is one that Kyle is also a co-PI on, and this is called the Whole Tail Project. And you can see kind of at the bottom of this slide, there's 5 universities here involved. So this is a a sort of big project across these different 5 institutions. And the idea of the project in a nutshell is trying to build a web-based platform to do reproducible computational research. So the idea is you go to wholetail.org, which you can do if you would like. And the idea there is you log in using your institutional ID, and then you're able to actually carry out your experiment remotely through that website. And in the background, what we've done is instrumented the Wholetail platform to do things like make access to your compute simpler, make storage of your bundles of research that go with the work that you're doing with the project easier. So this captures actually your scripts, the data, unique identifiers for the data, and so on in the work that you actually do to get to that result. So it helps automate and collect the data that you need in order to do reproducible research. It also, when you're ready, bundles all of that up together and makes a little publishable object that we call a tail. And so we've been working on standards for what that publishable object looks like when it gets shared. So the gap that we're trying to close there is one that I mentioned at the beginning when I said that, you know, we write up all of this information to make our work reproducible as scientists, and we do it in English mostly, and it's not sufficient. So we're trying to say, okay, so if we want to bring in computational aspects, we want to use code, we want to use data to help people understand what we actually did. In my opinion, there's no other way to do it. So what Wholetail is doing is it's starting to define those standards of what it means to actually share your computational work in a reproducible way. What does that bundle look? What do you need to include? What code do you need in there? How does it need to be organized? Where do you need to point to the data? So Wholetail takes a stab at answering those questions. I have a very quick example here of how Wholetail can work. So there was a publication in 2018, Ren et al. So Kyle is actually very familiar with this publication. And what this publication did in Science Advances is it did a number of machine learning experiments in material science looking for new compounds. And you can kind of see on the right there, I put some of there's a copy of the article there in Science Advances. So what is not uncommon for particularly younger researchers or people who want to share their code associated with their work, the code would be sitting in GitHub. And the data published to the materials data facility. And, or actually it used data that was already stored in the materials data facility. And so the question that the authors had was, now these things are all kind of floating around, right? You've got the paper floating in Science Advances, code sitting in GitHub, data that the work relies on is in the material data facility. Is there a way to tell people how to bring all these pieces together and knit them to reproduce the work? And so how do you publish code data that supports the results that were in that paper, provides transparency, allows people to reuse the code, find the data, try their ideas on the data, do some comparisons, validate the work, and so on. And so this work was then implemented in Wholetail by the authors, and it solves all those problems. So that's one of the use cases. So just very briefly, what are we publishing? Manuscript, documentation, code, data, what are your results? What environment did you use to actually produce those results? Provenance through the computations to actually get those results. Different types of metadata and descriptors for all of those objects that I just pointed out. And what version of the tail? So those are, so you sort of think, you might have thought when we first started talking about this, like, yeah, that's so obvious. Of course, computation is going to start disrupting and accelerating science like it has done all over society. And then when you start peeling back the layers of the onion, it's actually a reasonably complex problem to try to solve, how you bring that level of transparency and reproducibility to computational work. Okay, so our tail research object, different places where you can go ahead and look. And we think the standards are quite important because we want people to have research output that's interoperable. Okay, so what does Wholetail do? Hopefully, our goal, improving and accelerating discovery, our standards for scholarly dissemination, We are observing how people use whole tail, so it becomes a test bed for understanding policy decisions, gaps in reproducibility, things that we need to solve. We can do meta-science research, so do queries across different methodologies that were used on a data set, or one methodology and do queries across different data sets. And these are types of things that are not possible right now in the scholarly record. And we can study all types of incentives for use, pain points, and so on. So we also see this as really a research environment as well, not just a tool. Okay, so the second example I will very briefly mention is around standards development for reproducibility. In 2016, there was a AAAS workshop. I helped organize this workshop, and it was on code and modeling. Kate was also involved in that workshop. And we came up as a community, or sort of workshop participants came up with recommendations based on our discussions over those couple of days. Sharing data, software, workflows, details of the computational environment, providing links to those objects, citing all of those objects, not just citing a paper like we traditionally would. So giving people credit when they produce some awesome code that people use a lot, or a really important data set, for example. Documentation, licensing all of these objects so people can legally reuse it. So you were probably wondering when the law part of my background would come in. That's where it comes in. And then journals can actually help. So this isn't all on the researchers or the tools. Journals can publish work that is computationally reproducible in a way that now, as communities, we're starting to be able to define. Funding agencies can support this too. So we went ahead and published that in Science. And since then, there's been work, for example, in national academies, other sort of standard setting bodies, NIST, for example, around what are standards for producing reproducible work? What's adequately documented code? What do the data need to be looking like? How do they operate with other data sets? All of these questions that researchers have, and we're all, as a community, working towards solutions. So different things that I like to work on. I like test beds that evaluate actionable social change and computational reproducibility. It's a fascinating place to work because you get to work on the technology and the platforms, but also you're working with the people who are trying to do research, and you have to be sensitive to the incentives and the social structures for any type of change to come around reproducibility. So there's an entire cultural side to the projects and the problems that it's really interesting. I'm very interested in allowing comparisons between research output. So think about two different researchers who are answering the same question. Maybe they're doing it independently. They just kind of, it occurred to them at the same time, and they get different answers to the same question. How do we figure out who's right? We've got to have levels of transparency around what was done in the computations, as well as other types of transparency, but we've got to be able to compare these results and compare these full pipelines of data inference. Interoperability, synthesizing results, querying across results, across code, across data, and augmenting and improving the efficiency and cost effectiveness of how we utilize these objects and how we're actually doing the research. And as you probably already have figured out, all of this work in reproducibility is across many different communities and many different stakeholders. So one researcher can produce reproducible work, but if journals aren't on board, funding agencies aren't on board, promotions committees and so on at universities aren't on board, libraries aren't on board, that person's job is much harder, right? So these are really community efforts. Okay, so now that's the substance of the talk. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my background and how I got here and why I'm working on this. And then I'll turn it back to Katie. So I'll give you the brief story. And as Katie mentioned earlier, I'm very happy to take questions on any of these aspects. But when I grew up in Canada and when I went to undergraduate, I actually went and chose to study economics. And one of the things that fascinated me about that field was not only the ability to leverage mathematics and really be able to draw mathematical conclusions, but also be able to do all kinds of interesting policy analysis. So at some fundamental level, I had this idea that with policies, we could improve the world, right? We could allow people to do things that would make us all better off if they were, for example, free to pursue things that they wanted to, and so on. So sort of that area of economics is called social welfare economics. So I was absolutely fascinated by it. I realized that, and I assumed I would go on to do a PhD, and I had been working at Stanford at the time, and I thought, okay, time to apply for my PhD programs. I went and spoke to faculty in the economics department at Stanford, and I noticed a couple of things. The first thing I noticed is that just about everything these people were doing was quantitative in some way. They had already kind of bitten the bullet in terms of the data analysis, and everybody was studying data everywhere. And the other thing I noticed is most of their methods, at least in economics that I was investigating at that time, their methods were very in-house. So they always used what they called econometrics, which is the methodology within the field of economics. And econometrics is largely regression. There's some time series thrown in there, but that's basically the toolbox. And I thought, well, if I'm really interested in these empirical analyses of policy changes and their impacts, why wouldn't I try to get as big of a toolbox as possible? So for example, there were things like pattern recognition and other things happening in computer science, happening in statistics that just weren't kind of something that was part of the discussion in economics. So instead of doing a PhD in economics, I did a PhD in stats. And this really, this met the goal of increasing my toolbox and then some, like far more than I ever had any appreciation for until I actually studied it, how broad the field of statistics actually is. And so this was, like any PhD should be, this was transformative to the way that I think and to my goals and how I wanted to structure my career. And one of the things that I learned in stats, and I largely credit my advisor, David Donahoe, with this, which is just really to think scientifically, right? And so how do you think scientifically in a quantitative environment or sort of a data-enabled environment? And that's not easy, and I learned a lot from him and was largely inspired by him. However, in stats, I didn't really do any policy analysis, which I was interested in. So I thought law school would be a good place to try to bring all these quantitative skills that I now had to bear on some of the policy decisions and work and analysis that I had been interested in for so many years. As a graduate student, I had built some connections and done some collaboration with some law faculty at Stanford. And I remember one of them who had become and still is something of a mentor, sort of talking to him about my job hunt and so on as I was graduating. And he said, well, have you thought about coming to law school? And I kind of said, well, not really. But he's like, we have tons of data, tons of problems we're working on. Law faculty are just starting to get their minds around, data-enabled research. We would love to, have some collaboration on this. And I thought, well, that's actually interesting. There are established fields in law, like, for example, law and economics, that would be places that are just sort of ready for greater application of quantitative methods in policy. And so that was my reason for moving to law school, to kind of knit all these threads together that I was interested in. It didn't really work out that way. It was a little naive in the sense that law school, what they want to do is train lawyers. They're less about scholarship than, something like a stats department or an economics department, for example. That's just the way that they're oriented. And so, but it did give me tools and perspectives around how reproducibility fits together with legal problems and intellectual problems that I sort of touched on earlier. And so in that sense, it really did crystallize. It was during law school that it dawned on me that maybe reproducibility really is a place I can make an impact given the skills that I have. And I should mention that my advisor, when I was a PhD student, he made us all work reproducibly. So we all had to share code and share data. We actually built little platforms for all the work that we did. So as a grad student, part of my thesis was to do that. And you can still see it up there. It's 2004, 2005. So the HTML looks a little bit dated at the moment, but it's still there at sparselab.stanford.edu. That was part of my thesis and is a reproducibility platform where we tried to share tools around a particular topic and bring researchers together around that topic to use the same tools and really kind of coalesce a community there. So there are a number of attributes of my work that were appealing to the information science community as well, which you've probably heard me talking about, things like communication, standards for publication, curation, data preservation, provenance. All of these things have homes in information science. So this was part of my move to University of Illinois that Katie mentioned. And then I've since just moved to University of Southern California, and this is it, it's my last move. But there's actually a very similar type of relationship with, if you think about things like systems engineering and a data science pipeline or a pipeline of research as a information or sort of knowledge production system. And I think there are many engineering approaches that have been developed and tried and true over years and years and years that can be brought to bear on this problem very productively. So that's kind of how that marriage is working. So I actually haven't paid attention to time, so hopefully I'm sure I'm over, hopefully not too much over, but I can stop here and turn it back to you, Katie.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that incredible talk. I think hopefully questions are like popping up in folks' heads. As that happens, put them in the chat, write them down, or save them for later. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to our next speaker. Okay, is this slide showing all right for folks? Great. Okay, I will read from my phone this time. So our second speaker joining us today is Dr. Kate Keahey, who is a senior computer scientist at Argonne National Laboratory and the Consortium for Advanced Science and Engineering, or CASE, at the University of Chicago. She is the principal investigator of Chameleon, an NSF-funded research project which provides an innovative experimentation platform for computer science systems experiments. She is a pioneer of cloud computing as the creator of Nimbus, one of the first open source implementations of infrastructure as a service. Her research interests span resource management, replicability, high performance computing, Internet of Things, and edge computing. Dr. Keahey received her PhD and master's in computer science from Indiana University, and prior to that attended Gdansk University of Technology in Poland. Kate and the Chameleon team have been advocates and longtime mentors of the Summer Lab program, and we have benefited so much from having them as part of our program. And so we are so delighted to welcome Kate here today as a speaker. Great.
All right. Thank you, Katie, for the lovely introduction. Can anybody see my screen? Anybody at all?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, looks good. Fantastic. I did not prepare any slides about myself. So let me just maybe do a very quick introduction about why I'm doing what I'm doing. It sort of ties to Katie's introduction a little bit. I work in distributed computing. It sort of started when I was a grad student. I attended one of the supercomputing conferences, which had a global experiment going on called iWay. And the purpose of that experiment, this is mid-90s, of course, was to combine various supercomputing centers via networks. And at that time, the received wisdom was that a supercomputing center was something that you put millions of dollars of investment into and buy a lot of machines, and then you dial in by a modem, right? So the big breakthrough there was to actually put and activate relatively high-speed networks, or what was high-speed at the time, between those supercomputing centers, see if people could collaboratively, using distributed resources, solve a problem, right? And that was really groundbreaking, because that shifted people's perception of what can be done within the internet, and that also gave rise to something called grid computing that Kyle and myself have worked in for many, many years, right? It's largely another name for distributed computing, I would say. So anyhow, working in this distributed computing, I started working with a lot of domain scientists, mostly physicists, and that was a lot of fun, because they don't know that much about computer science, or at least they know less about computer science than physics or their own area, of course. And to make a long story short, they're always trying to do something that can't be done, right? So if you want to solve problems, if you're looking for interesting problems to solve, this is a wonderful environment, right? There's always somebody who wants to do something that can't be done yet, right? It's enormously inspirational. And one way to sum up my career could be to say that I have been working on building scientific instruments, right? So scientific instruments are something like, let's say, an astronomer is going to need a telescope to look at the sky. And as we look at the sky in different ways and look deeper, we needed more sophisticated telescopes, right? So we need more sophisticated instruments. And sometimes it requires as much ingenuity and creativity to build scientific instruments as to solve the scientific problem itself, right? So this is roughly what I do. And also, if you want to see how scientific instruments built in software, in particular, enable science, I just recently put together a special issue of the Software X journal, which publishes software rather than academic results. And it shows you step by step how the sausage is made, right? How scientific instruments in software enable science, right? From modeling detectors to actually operating them, to looking at the data, to providing methods that share the data, and so forth. So very interesting if you want to see how software enables scientific instruments in software. But today, I wanted to talk more about a different instrument, a scientific instrument rendered in infrastructure called Chameleon. So Chameleon is a scientific instrument for computer scientists, right? It supports computer science experiments. And of course, it's a bit of a watering hole, right? Everybody in computer science, they're working on operating system and virtualization and networking and AI and all sorts of interesting and very disparate topics. They come to the system to get resources. So we figured, well, we have a watering hole, so we might as well open a lemonade stand, right? Make it more refreshing, easier for those scientists to look at problems. And in a sense, to share not just resources, but also to see whether by sharing their results, their research, their experiments, we can accelerate science in some way, right? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And it's a different flavor of reproducibility, I would say, than what Victoria was talking about, not just because it's very focused on research in computer science specifically, rather than being more general across many sciences, but also because we're taking a practical approach. We're trying to get as many people as possible to share their experiments on Chameleon, right? So I'm going to tell you what we're doing specifically for that. So first of all, Chameleon is in experimental test bed. And we all know chameleons like to change, right? And the way that this specific chameleon changes is it adapts itself to your computer science experiment, right? So if you're developing a new operating system, for example, you will likely have to boot from custom kernel. You will, of course, have to have root. You will want to power the machine on, power it off, reboot it. And so on and so forth, right? So we provide all of those things, right? You come to the system, you take some nodes, and they are under your exclusive ownership for the time that you have your lease. And then you can, without interruption from anybody else, without some workloads that you can't control running on your system, you can run your experiments. So second thing to know about Chameleon, we've got thousands of cores to support big compute experiments, right? As many thousands of homogeneous cores as we can afford. We've got 6 petabytes of storage in a variety of different configurations to enable a variety of different experiments, big data experiments. And then we have 2 sites, one at University of Chicago, another at TAC Advanced Computing Centers, right? Our University of Chicago hardware is actually located at Argonne, right? So those are 2 big supercomputing centers that operate the resources for Chameleon, and they are connected with a 100G network, so you can experiment with large flows as well. And then in addition to this, we have very diverse hardware as well, right? So we have different computer architectures, ARMs and atoms. We have a lot of different GPUs. So if you're doing machine learning, data science research, it's probably a lot of opportunity there. We've got FPGAs, we've got interesting networking hardware. So like we're trying to support many different experiments. And then an interesting thing about Chameleon is that it's built on an open source mainstream project called OpenStack, right? So OpenStack is an open source implementation of infrastructure as a service. It's widely used in both academia and industry. A lot of people are familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, you're going to be learning something that is going to be useful. In fact, very often we ask our students, after this summer, what have you learned? They say, well, I learned OpenStack, right? They learn OpenStack by using Chameleon. But then, of course, the kind of cloud that we operate, a systems research cloud, is very much unlike any other cloud, right? So it's an enhanced cloud, a cloud plus. Right? So it provides this bare metal reconfigurability, which a lot of commercial clouds don't provide, on all sorts of diverse resources, but it also provides things like advanced reservations, for example, that allow you to do things a little bit easier. And of course, it's a widely used system. We've had almost 6,000 users since its inception. We're almost 6 years old, just 10 more days to the anniversary. And we were just extended recently till the end of 2024, right? So there's going to be quite a bit longer of Chameleon. So we have resources. How do you use those resources? So Jason Anderson, later on, who also is behind various reproducibility mechanisms that we put into the system, he's going to give you a very nice demo later on. But right now, just sort of high-level view. Right? If you think about an experiment, you're formulating a hypothesis, then you need to look for resources, right? So if you're doing data science, you might be looking for GPUs, for example. Then to allocate those resources, you need to take out ownership of those resources, exclusive ownership, so nobody else is running on those resources, right? So maybe you want to create a 4-node GPU cluster. Then you need to configure them. In other words, put either Ubuntu or CentOS or whatever operating system you want to have there, and whatever libraries and so forth. And then once you configure the system, right, you want to save that configuration. It's called snapshotting. Save that configuration so that when you come back to the system in the future, you can boot directly from that configuration, right? You don't have to redo that whole configuration work again. And then we support orchestration, which is something that allows you to create virtual clusters or complex distributed constructs, like maybe cloud deployments or complex networking experiments and things like that. And then we also support some specialized network reconfiguration mechanisms, such as stitching and bring your own controller. And then eventually you want to run your experiment, you monitor it. We provide some mechanisms to get at your monitoring data. And all of this is available via a web GUI, via a command line interface, and also, thanks to JSON, via Jupyter Notebook that have been integrated with Chameleon. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. So moving on to the reproducibility topic now, what problem are we trying to solve, right? So if you think about scientists, they very often have a reproducibility dilemma, and it's a cost dilemma, right? So should I invest in making my experiments repeatable? So by the way, repeatability is a little bit different than reproducibility. Reproducing an experiment is reproducing the result that somebody published by potentially some other means, but using the artifacts that they provide, such as data, for example. Repeating something is doing it the same way they did it, right? So you're not doing any other stuff, right? You're repeating just exactly the actions that they had. This repeating experiments is very useful on test beds, right? Because it allows you to do it very quickly, potentially, and a test bed and having the same environment as others makes that possible, right? So people are asking, should I invest time in making experiments repeatable, or should I do new research instead, right? Because it's going to take some extra effort to make things repeatable, And where would that effort go otherwise? Well, you'd be doing more research. There's an even more interesting dilemma on the receiving side, right? So if you package your experiment for repeatability and nobody repeats it, what's the point, right? If a tree falls in the forest kind of thing, what's the point, right? So the question is, does anybody repeat it? And why should they repeat it, right? So should I invest in repeating this experiment? Or maybe it's better just to do my own stuff from scratch, right? So there are dilemmas, there's cost on both sides, both on making your experiment repeatable and on actually repeating somebody else's experiment, right? So we were looking on how to make this better, right? What is the value proposition? Given that it has a cost, what can we do to either provide incentives or lower the cost, right? Such that this actually becomes something that is adopted and viable. And so we looked at the value of repeating experiments, and Victoria already talked a lot about the ability to validate it, which is one of the reasons, of course. But then there's another reason, which is introducing variation, right? Maybe you're taking an experiment that somebody did 10 years ago, but now the hardware is different, right? And maybe something that was not visible then can be seen, or maybe something that they overlooked at that time because the instrument was not didn't provide resolution enough, right? They could do now, right? So introducing variation is a very interesting value proposition for repeating experiments. And then there's entertainment. And I think that's not to be underestimated. So right now, the way we experience research is often via people's papers, which are fascinating. But we experience that research in a passive way. If we could replay their research, if we could turn that into a game, if we could play around with it and change various parameters of the experiments that they did, how much more that interactive exploration, how much more fun would that be, right? Maybe it's not as good as killing zombies or whatever your game is, but it's a lot of fun, generally speaking, right? So being able to experience that research, I think is a very, very powerful reason. And so, the question arises is, can we make experiments as shareable as papers are today? So when I start a new research topic, and when I start looking at a new question, generally speaking, I go out and I read what others have written about it and look at what they discovered and base my research on that. But I don't repeat their experiments. I don't replay their results. I don't play with that. Would it be possible to change that, right? Wouldn't it be possible to live in a world that if you want to do some research, you play around and fool around with some stuff that others did, and you learn from that and get ideas, right? So the holy grail here is to reduce time to package the experiment and also the time to repeat the experiment, right? So hopefully if we can make the packaging of the experiment a side effect of developing it, that would go a long way, right? And then the time to repeat should also be something that should be motivational, something that you actually want to do. So we're focusing on this practical reproducibility. And when you think about it, what makes an experiment repeatable? So first of all, you have to have access to the same resources, or at least the same type of resources as the original experimenter, right? So this is something that clouds and test beds like Chameleon specifically enable, and this is a sort of baseline necessary condition for reproducibility, right? Because if you have a test bed or if you have access to the same resources, it's no longer the case that I have a cluster of GPUs in the basement of my department and I can run this experiment and you can't because you don't have access to a cluster of GPUs, right? So test beds and clouds and public resources create that baseline for reproducibility. The other interesting thing that happens when you use clouds is that you effectively, in order to use clouds, you package your experimental environment, right? This is not something that happens when you're just running on your laptop or maybe some machine in a lab, right? Very often you don't know how those things are configured, right? Or maybe somebody else even configured them for you. When you run on a cloud, you deploy a disk image or a virtual machine image or, depending on what cloud you're using on that cloud. And that disk image, if you played your cards right, has all the information that is necessary to recreate your experimental environment, right? So we have shared resources and we have shared experimental environments, and we haven't done anything yet, right? We just used clouds the way they're supposed to be used, right? So as a side effect, we can reproduce those experiments. So what is missing? Well, one thing that is missing is your experimental process and the data that you're using and the analysis of the data, and also some sort of story that tells people why you're doing what you're doing. And then you'd like to do it easily, and there are some other considerations that are perhaps optimizations, right? Not as important. So in Chameleon, what does it look like? We have hardware that is described at a very fine grain, and that we also version. So if you run your experiments, come back 6 months later, we upgraded the memory, you can see that it's a different version, and your experiment you might yield different results if you repeat it on that hardware. But secondly, our users created thousands and thousands of images and thousands of orchestration templates that can be used for recreating the experimental environment that they have, right? So that is something that we get as a side effect of using the systems. Nothing happened yet. So now we have to package the experimental process, connect all those pieces together, share it with our collaborators, or publish it. So how do we do that in Chameleon? So first of all, we use something called literate programming. So it's a concept defined by Donald Knuth, which I hope everybody knows who that is, many, many years ago. And the idea there was to create experimental storytelling by combining ideas and process and results. And nowadays, there are many actual implementations of that literate programming concepts. One of the most popular ones is Jupyter Notebooks, right? I think that most people probably have seen Jupyter Notebooks. They combine text and code and results in terms of graphs and images and whatever that is. But Jupyter Notebooks, from our perspective, or the perspective of our users, have one big shortcoming, which is that the code in those code cells gets executed on the back end in a Docker container. But that's not enough for most of the people who are experimenting, for example, in distributed environment, or want to experiment with powerful resources. So the experiments that our users do look something like what I just showed here, right? So there are multiple nodes connected by multiple switches, by multiple network circuits, so complicated things. So how do we marry Jupyter with that need, right? So what we did is we made Chameleon credentials implicit in the Jupyter code cells, right? So integrated Jupyter and Chameleon. So when you log into Chameleon, you are effectively logged in via your Jupyter notebook. And in that Jupyter notebook, you can use Python or Bash, if you want, to create Chameleon experimental containers, and then later on execute things in those experimental containers. And we've got a little screencast in a paper if you want more details about that. So now you've got your experiment, which provides this integrated storytelling, and you want to share it with your collaborators, right? So how do you do that? Well, to do that, we provide something called Trovy, which is a sharing portal, which allows you to create buckets for your research, or depositions for your research, where it's a very similar concept to the whole tail concept that Victoria described, right? Where you can put all the artifacts that go into your experiments or into your experiment or are needed by your experiment. So it's a little bit like Google Drive, right? You work with somebody on a project, and you put all the documents and code and images and data and whatever you have in a shared Google Drive, and then create your end result based on that, right? So Trovy is kind of like that metaphor for sharing, and then you have a portal where you can go and look at the various different artifacts that people created and try to repeat them. So, for example, we've got some resources that you can find and play with, and that Jason will also demonstrate in his demo later on. if you filter on experiment, you can find various packaged experiments, and you won't find many. There's maybe like a dozen of them right now, but you can play, or you can use them for teaching, for instruction, right? You can play, for example, with the AlexNet paper. You can reproduce it in about an hour, right? Because it has been packaged by somebody for reproducibility specifically. And then there are screencasts by various students who packaged experiments. So if you go to our YouTube channel available from the main Chameleon main page, you'll see stories of packaging of the various different experiments where the students share not just the packaging, but also their experiences of packaging those experiments. And then you can also look at a poster one of our students did last year that talks about reproducing the AlexNet specifically, and then introducing variation, right? Running it on modern hardware and examining it under various different conditions. So last few words about how do we go from sharing to publications, right? So how do we share experimental artifacts? And obviously I work with a journal that publishes software, so publishes experimental artifacts, but how would we publish experiments in particular, right? So when we look at our current publishing ecosystem, so we write papers, put those papers in proceedings, put those proceedings in libraries, and then there's some indexing system that allows people to find them. There's one big difference between sharing papers and sharing electronic artifacts, right? Which is that papers is something that I can read, and I don't need any special tools to do that. Maybe a pair of glasses I need, but that's it. Digital artifacts are zeros and ones, and we can't really interact with them without some help, right? So digital artifacts like experiments will need a test bed to replay them. And that could be Chameleon. And if you think about our traditional publishing system, it's not that different. If you go to a library and check out, let's say, microfilm, the library will probably provide a microfilm reader to read that film. Right? So when we're talking about publishing experimental artifacts, what would make that publishing and sharing effective? Well, one thing that would make it effective is having a cloud or some other public resource on which they can be replayed easily. But in a sort of wider publishing ecosystem, there's also some sort of handle that you need in order to look at those artifacts. And this is why we also integrated Chameleon with Zenodo, which is a fantastic publishing platform, was developed at CERN. And you can publish your experimental artifacts there directly from Trovi, and they will be assigned DOIs, digital object identifiers, and you can cite them from your paper later on, right? You write a paper and say, oh, here's my experiment. And what we're going to do very soon is provide a Chameleon day pass, right? So if you put your experiment in your paper, somebody will be able to click on it. That will create a request for the paper author to grant you temporary short-term access to Chameleon just for the purposes of reproducing an experiment, and you'll be off to the races. You'll be able to play with their experiment and introduce variation and so forth. Okay, a few parting thoughts is it's very important to package experiments, right, to provide reproducibility. But it's also very important if we're going to really make that stick, to look at the other side of that and look at how much effort it takes to reproduce or to repeat, right? So, and then again, reproducible experiments will rely on the existence of public resources, right? That's the reproducibility baseline. And what we're trying to do is use what you have approach, right? So we're leveraging the fact that if you're using clouds, if you're using remote resources, you're in practice packaging half of your experiment already, right? And we're hoping ultimately to create a marketplace for repeating research, right? Where there is a demand side that is as strong and motivated as the supply side, right? Because again, if you make your experiment reproducible, nobody reproduces that. That's a lot of effort that maybe is not used as efficiently as it could be. So last thing, coming soon, we've got the Chameleon Day Pass. Our students will be using that as a pilot for their supercomputing posters. If anybody here is thinking of doing the same, please do let us know. We'll make you part of the pilot. And end of August, we're planning a repeatability hackathon. So an opportunity to package your experiments in such a way that others can replay it on Chameleon. And this is all I have. And I think I'm a little bit out of time. I apologize for that, but if there are questions, I'd love to answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Victoria. We are over time, but with the time that we hopefully have, if our speakers have a kind, 2 minutes for at least one, hopefully good question. Let's all turn videos on since we can all see one another now. And we will try to get to as many as we can. I would, ask our speakers too, if you're open to, emails from students or like continuing conversation afterwards, we can definitely help facilitate that as well. All right, so we have a lot of questions in the chat, which is fantastic. And let me make sure that folks can unmute themselves. There we go. Eric Chandler, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. This is for either speaker. So I was wondering how you went about unifying standards and providing for so many diverse groups who use different tools and change the tools they use at different rates and have just different needs.
You're asking that in the past tense, like as if we did it. So that's a really important challenge, right? So there's no like boss of science, right? So there's not like one dictator that can come in and say, this is how it's going to be, and this is how you guys are going to do it. It's just a bunch of people trying to do their best all over the place. And so then the question becomes, how do people converge on standards? And this is a very long discussion, and Kate is leading that discussion. As we all know, infrastructure can influence and dictate standards for better or for worse. So how the infrastructure is designed is very important in the standard setting discussion, but this is long and complex and you need people to buy into it. And so that's another reason for having discussions. So I don't know what the standards are going to end up looking like, but we need them. Results have to be able to talk to each other. As Kate said, you need to be able to replay these objects in some cloud. It's what can I only replay Kate's objects in the cloud? No, it has to be a sort of universal standard, and it is a very complicated and long process to get there. Not that we won't, but things like national academies, for example, they write reports, and that's about bringing people together to sort of start to understand these standards.
Yeah. And I agree with that completely. I would say for us, the questions may be a little bit easier because we define our problem much more narrowly than what Victoria is doing. So I said one of the benefits of being based on mainstream open source platform is that, for example, there are also mainstream tools that convert artifacts, digital artifacts from that platform to other platforms, right? So if you want to take an experiment from Chameleon and rerun it on one of the commercial clouds, there are tools that will take your image and convert. Now, this is not repeating anymore, right? Because this may be replicating because you're converting image, you're effectively running your experimental environment on different setting in different conditions, right? Maybe you're even not running it on bare metal anymore. Now you're running it in a virtualized environment, right? So there's going to be a little bit of difference, but that's, so long as you're aware of that variation, so long as you're aware that you're injecting variation in this way, you can control for it and may lead to interesting results, right? So we actually published a paper recently that describes the process of how to convert experiments on Chameleon to commercial clouds and even run them there, right? But that again, mainstream open source is a big part of the equation. And I think it's also a big part of the standards discussion, right? The more people can, the way the best standards emerge is generally that people seek interoperability, they produce tools for interoperability, and they start realizing that there are limitations to those tools, right? So maybe something should be standardized. But you're completely right. This is a big problem, But we're scientists, right? We're in it for big problems, so that's good.
Thanks for your insight.
Fantastic. Victoria and Kate, do you maybe have 5 more minutes so we can get one more question in? I want to be respectful of your time as well. All right, Kaushal, can you ask your question? I don't think we can hear you. I see you're unmuted. All right, I might ask it for Kaushal for the sake of time. So Kaushal asks, how do you effectively distinguish whether a discrepancy in two different results was due to computational reproducibility or not?
So that's kind of the key question, right? So there's no way to do that if the only information I have about how those results were produced is written in English.
Yeah.
So one of the things that that all of these platforms and the technological developments around reproducibility are trying to do is allow those types of comparisons so that we understand computationally as well as mathematically as well as in the theory how the results were produced. We absolutely have to be able to do that, and right now it's extremely challenging if you just take your favorite paper out of the literature and try to understand the sources of uncertainties around that results. We have a long history in stats around understanding the mathematics of uncertainties in terms of our models. People are probably familiar with concepts like confidence intervals. We have almost no history of understanding how computation has contributed to the uncertainties in those results. And this is, I think, a wide open area and a very important area to do work.
Yeah, and it's, a broader version of that question is really, I think, led to many important scientific discoveries, right? So this is, for example, how neutrino was discovered, right? They did an experiment on a wooden table, published the results. People tried to reproduce it on a marble table, could not. Why? Was the result wrong? And it turned out that there's a new particle, right? So it's a very fundamental question for reproducibility, I think.
Yeah, it's also, it's sort of this intellectual, that's a great point, Kate. It's this longstanding intellectual problem in scientific investigation, which is, have you captured all the influences on your results?
Exactly.
Right? And, the gold standard is to do the controlled experiment in science. It's not always possible, but then when you really think about what is a controlled experiment, like even if you think about a lab where the bench is hydraulically leveled, the temperature is controlled to 4 decimal point, like they control for everything. You don't really know at the end of the day you got everything. And I'm also thinking about this recent, maybe like 3 years ago experiment where there was a discovery that in the lab, the mice are sensitive to the gender of the handler. So the mice react differently if men are doing the experiment and then sort of, monitoring them and so on, or if it's women. And we didn't know this. And so I remember being at actually a National Academy's panel discussion around reproducibility a few years ago, right after this came out. And there were many big lab heads there, and they were like, what else? I didn't keep track of who, the gender of whomever was doing the experiments. What else am I missing that's going to cause problems and so on? And so, science is imperfect. And the reason we have the scientific method is because we are trying to improve and root out error as much as possible as we go. Are we perfect at it? Of course not. But that's our goal.
Yeah, but that's also why reproducibility is important, right? If I try to reproduce your experiment and count, right, then the question arises, and otherwise it does not.
Yeah, it's also an interesting question too, because there's a kind of, you don't know where the error lies, right? It could be in the person, the methods of the person doing the reproduction, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is when there's uncertainty in terms of what is being communicated around the experiment, like it's not, you don't have the code or it's not transparent. There's this big and like sort of cognitive gap where it's possible to just blame the person who is trying to do the repeat because they didn't do it right or whatnot. But maybe it's possible, but we don't know because there's all this missing information. And so it's a real challenge because probably work that didn't repeat doesn't get reported because people, especially junior scientists, don't want to sort of get a lot of blame, unfair blame, right? It's very difficult to understand where the problems are.
And they also don't get credit for negative results, which is another problem in science, I think. But yeah.
See how important all the incentives in the human side is.
So kudos for asking a very insightful question.
Awesome. Well, I want to just maybe wrap up by saying, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much, Victoria and Kate, for joining us and shedding light on an issue that I think is germane to everyone's projects as computational scientists, but maybe hasn't been talked about explicitly as part of their project. So this is, I think, hugely beneficial and just incredibly interesting. I feel like we could have a conversation about reproducibility for a whole workshop. So thank you so much for joining us.